Hello everyone, I am the Scary Midnight Dreams and I am here to help you to sleep today. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also comment where are you from and what time is in your country right now. The Mirror's Curse. It was a dreary autumn afternoon when I, Clara Blackwood, received the inheritance that would change the course of my life. The letter had come unexpectedly, sealed with the dark wax of my grandmother's family crest. My heart stirred with a mixture of sorrow and curiosity as I read the words, penned in her familiar, elegant hand. She had passed, leaving behind a legacy of wealth and secrets, but there was one thing that stood out: a mirror, a relic of old, which she had always kept hidden away. It was said to be an heirloom, passed down through generations, and yet I had never seen it before. My grandmother had always spoken of it with a peculiar reverence, warning me never to look into it, as if it were a thing of great power, a thing best left untouched. But as I stood in the darkened parlor of her old, decaying estate, I could not resist. The mirror was an antique of exquisite craftsmanship, framed in tarnished silver and adorned with intricate, swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe under the dim light. Its glass was unnaturally clear, like a still pool of water, reflecting the room with a perfection that felt wrong. There was something in its depths, something beyond the reflection of mere walls and furniture, something that beckoned me. I did not understand then what I was about to encounter, nor did I know the danger that lay within the frame. The first time I gazed into it, I saw nothing more than my own reflection, my pale face, framed by dark, untamed hair, my eyes wide with curiosity. But as I continued to stare, something began to shift. My reflection blurred, then twisted, as though the mirror were alive, warping the image into something unrecognizable. For a moment, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but then I saw it clearly. Her, a woman, identical to me in every way, but her eyes were hollow, her face twisted in an expression of agony. She seemed to be trapped within the glass, her hands pressed against the surface, her lips moving soundlessly, as though pleading for help. I recoiled, heart pounding in my chest, but the reflection remained, frozen in place, staring back at me. I stumbled away, my mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The mirror had shown me something that was not real. Or was it? Could it have been a vision of the future? In the days that followed, I could not resist returning to the mirror. Each time I looked into it, I saw more. At first, the glimpses were fleeting, almost imperceptible. A shadow moving just beyond the edge of my reflection, a flicker of movement in the corner of the glass. But as the days turned into weeks, the visions grew clearer, more distinct, and more horrifying. I saw myself, standing in the very same room, but the air was thick with a malevolent presence. My reflection would smile at me, but the smile was wrong, twisted, as if the woman in the glass were mocking me. I saw myself in dark alleys, my hands stained with blood, my eyes wide with terror as I ran from something that was never quite visible, and always in the background, the reflection of that twisted woman, her hollow eyes staring, waiting. The mirror was showing me my future, each vision more nightmarish than the last. I saw myself standing at the edge of a cliff, my reflection pulling me toward the abyss. I saw the twisted woman, now standing behind me, her hands resting on my shoulders, her breath cold against my skin. And always I heard her voice, a whisper, a soundless plea that seemed to echo from the depths of the glass. Come to me, and I will set you free. But I knew that freedom was a lie. The mirror was not showing me the future. It was pulling me into it. The more I looked, the more I was drawn into its depths, as if the glass were reaching out, grasping for me, pulling me closer with each passing day. My reflection no longer felt like a mere image. but a thing of its own, a separate entity, alive with a hunger that could not be sated. I tried to destroy it. I tried to shatter the cursed thing, to burn it, to bury it in the earth. But nothing worked. The mirror would always return, pristine and undamaged, waiting for me. It was as though it had become a part of me, and I could not escape its grasp. As the days wore on, the line between reality and nightmare began to blur. I no longer knew if I was awake or trapped in some waking dream. I saw the twisted woman in every reflection, in every window, in every dark corner of the room. She was always there, watching, waiting, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled my very soul, that one day she would take my place. I could feel her presence growing stronger, her pull becoming more irresistible. The mirror's curse had taken hold of me, and there was no escape. I had become a part of its twisted world, and it would never let me go. The Puppeteer's Game. It was a bitter winter evening in 1898 when I, Thomas Gray, a struggling artist in the heart of London, first laid eyes upon the marionette. I had spent the better part of the last year in a state of creative paralysis, my once illustrious career reduced to mere scraps of failed canvases and unfinished sketches. My reputation, once that of a promising young painter, had all but vanished, leaving me to scrape by in the dim-lit corners of art studios and lowly taverns. My work had no soul, no life, merely the hollow echo of what it once was. That evening, as I returned to my modest flat after yet another failed attempt to capture the elusive spark of inspiration, I found a package waiting for me on my doorstep. There was no note, no indication of the sender, only a small wooden box, intricately carved with patterns that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. My curiosity piqued. I brought the box inside, the cold air biting at my skin as I set it upon my work table. Inside the box lay the marionette. It was unlike any puppet I had ever seen. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Its wooden limbs were slender and delicate, and its face, though painted in the most lifelike manner, was unnervingly serene. Its eyes, glassy and hollow, seemed to follow me as I examined it, and its smile, though faint, appeared to mock me. The strings that hung from its joints were fine, almost invisible, yet they seemed to shimmer in the dim candlelight, as though they were alive. There was something about it that unsettled me, yet I could not bring myself to part with it. In my desperate state, I saw the marionette as a symbol, a challenge perhaps, or a gift from some unknown benefactor who sought to reignite the flame of my creativity. And so, with a mixture of trepidation and excitement, I placed the puppet on my easel, its hollow eyes fixed upon me. That night, as I sat before my canvas, something strange began to happen. The marionette, though still, seemed to watch me with an intensity that I could not ignore. I felt a compulsion, an urge to paint, as though the very presence of the puppet was drawing the art from within me. My hand moved with a will of its own, the brush gliding across the canvas, as though guided by an unseen force. For the first time in months, I felt alive, my mind clear, my vision sharp. But as I painted, something darker began to stir within me. The marionette's smile grew wider, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. And then, to my horror, the strings attached to its limbs began to twitch. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, a product of my weary mind. But the puppet moved again, its wooden fingers twitching, its head tilting slightly as though acknowledging my presence. I froze, my brush suspended in midair, my heart pounding in my chest. The marionette's smile widened, and in that moment, I knew that something was terribly wrong. It was no longer a mere object, it was alive, and it was watching me, controlling me. As the days passed, the puppet's influence over me grew stronger. My work flourished, each stroke of the brush more precise, more inspired than the last. But with each passing hour, I felt myself slipping further from reality, my thoughts becoming clouded, my will bending to the marionette's command. I began to hear whispers in the dead of night, soft, insistent murmurs that seemed to come from the puppet itself. The voice was low and guttural, a voice that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. Paint. Paint. The masterpiece. I could not resist. The marionette's commands were irresistible, its presence overwhelming. It guided my hand, forcing me to paint scenes of unimaginable horror. Figures twisted and contorted in agony, landscapes consumed by fire and darkness, faces frozen in terror. Each painting was more grotesque than the last, and yet I could not stop. I was trapped in a nightmare of my own creation, a prisoner to the puppet's dark will. It was not long before I realized that the marionette was more than just a puppet. It was a conduit for something far darker, something ancient and malevolent. The more I painted, the more I felt its presence grow, a shadow that loomed over me, its strings tightening around my soul. One evening, as I worked late into the night, I stumbled upon an old book in the dusty corner of my studio. It was a tome bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age. As I flipped through the pages, I discovered the horrifying truth. The marionette was not a mere toy, but a vessel for a dark power that had been manipulating artists for centuries. The puppet was part of a long-forgotten cult, one that preyed upon the desperate and the ambitious, using their creativity to fuel its insatiable hunger. The marionette was not merely controlling my hand, it was feeding on my soul, drawing from the very essence of my being. The more I painted, the more I fed it, until there was nothing left of me. The silent neighbor. It was in the autumn of 1895 that Edward and Helen Lyle took residence in the quaint village of Ravenwood. The house they had chosen, a modest yet charming cottage, stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by ancient trees whose gnarled branches seemed to whisper secrets on the wind. The village, with its cobbled streets and ivy-clad cottages, appeared as though it had stepped out of some forgotten age. It was a place untouched by time, where the pace of life was slow and the air was thick with the scent of earth and decay. The neighbors were few, and the house beside theirs, an old manor shrouded in shadow, was inhabited by a solitary figure, a man of indeterminate age, whose name was never spoken aloud. The villagers spoke little of him, but there was an unspoken understanding that he was not a man to be approached. He was known only as Mr. Thorne, and his presence in the village had become something of a quiet legend, whispered about with a mix of fear and curiosity. At first, the Lyles thought little of their strange neighbor. The house next door stood in silent disrepair, its windows dark, its doors never opening to reveal the secrets within. Mr. Thorne, it seemed, was a man who valued his solitude, for he never ventured beyond the confines of his home, and no one ever saw him leave. His silence was absolute, a presence that seemed to hang in the air, suffocating and oppressive. But it was not long before the Lyles began to notice the strange occurrences. At first, it was subtle, objects misplaced, a chill that lingered in the air despite the warmth of the fire, the feeling of being watched when no one was there. Helen, ever the practical one, dismissed these things as the result of the house settling, the creaks and groans of an old building. But Edward, whose nerves were more easily frayed, began to feel an unease that he could not shake. It began with the sound of footsteps, faint and hesitant, echoing in the halls of their home at night. The footsteps seemed to come from the walls themselves, as though someone or something was moving just beyond their reach. At first, they thought it was merely the wind or the creaking of the house settling, but the footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, until they were unmistakable. Then came the whispers. They were soft at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but they grew in volume, in urgency, until they seemed to fill the entire house. Edward would wake in the dead of night, his heart pounding, to hear the faint murmur of voices, speaking in a language he could not understand. The whispers seemed to come from all directions, as though they were not confined to the walls, but were a part of the very air itself. Helen, too, began to feel the weight of the house's strange presence. She would often catch glimpses of shadows moving in the corners of her vision, fleeting and indistinct, as though something or someone was lurking just beyond the edge of the light. She would hear her name called in the dead of night, soft and breathless. But when she turned, no one was there. The couple, growing increasingly paranoid, began to suspect that their reclusive neighbor, Mr. Thorne, was somehow involved in these disturbances. They had never seen him, save for the occasional glimpse of his gaunt figure through the darkened windows of his house. He seemed to watch them, his eyes gleaming from the shadows, though he never made a sound, never moved. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows over the village, Edward could bear it no longer. He approached Mr. Thorne's house, his steps hesitant, his heart racing. He had to know the truth. He had to confront the source of the terror that had begun to consume their lives. As he stood before the manor's heavy door, it creaked open, as if inviting him in. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and a chill that seemed to seep into his very bones. He stepped inside, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. The house was dark, its rooms cold and barren, save for a single flickering candle that cast long, trembling shadows on the walls. And there, standing in the center of the room, was Mr. Thorne. But he was not a man at all. His eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light around them. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, and his mouth was twisted in a grotesque grin that never reached his eyes. He was a thing of nightmares, a creature that existed between the realms of the living and the dead, a being whose very presence seemed to drain the life from the air. "You should not have come," Mr. Thorne whispered, his voice like the rustling of dead leaves. "The house has chosen you, just as it chose me." Edward's breath caught in his throat, and he stepped back, horrified by the realization that this man, this thing, was not merely a neighbor, but a part of the nightmare that had begun to consume their home. The flesh-eater's bargain. It was in the year of 1892 that I, Jonathan Firth, a man of modest means, made a fateful decision that would forever alter the course of my existence. I was a man driven by ambition, consumed by the desire for wealth, status, and power. I had worked tirelessly, scraping by with barely enough to survive, and yet the life I had built felt hollow, devoid of meaning. My soul ached for more than the dreary confines of my small shop, more than the fleeting pleasures of a life spent in the shadows of those who had risen above me. It was on a bitter, moonless night that I first encountered the figure who would change my fate. I had been walking home through the narrow, cobbled streets of London, the fog swirling around me like a cloak of death, when I saw him. He stood at the corner of an alleyway, cloaked in shadow, his face obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. His presence was unsettling, as though the very air around him had been poisoned by his existence. "Are you seeking something, Mr. Firth?" the figure asked, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to vibrate through my bones. "Something more?" I froze, startled by the sound of my own name on his lips, but there was no time to react. Before I could speak, he continued, "I know what you desire. I can give it to you. Wealth beyond your wildest dreams, power that will bend the world to your will. But there is a price, of course. a price that must be paid in blood. His words, though dark and ominous, stirred something deep within me, a longing, a hunger for the very things he promised. My mind raced, torn between reason and desire. I had always been a man of pragmatism, but in that moment, I found myself unable to resist the lure of his offer. "What must I do?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The figure smiled, a cruel, twisted smile that did not reach his eyes. "You must feed the beast. Each day, you will offer it a sacrifice. Flesh, blood, the essence of life itself. The more you give, the more you shall receive. But remember, Mr. Firth, the hunger of the beast is insatiable. It will grow with each passing day, and one day it will come for you." I hesitated, but only for a moment. The thought of wealth, of power, of a life free from the crushing weight of poverty consumed me. I agreed to the bargain without fully understanding the cost, and with a cold, unsettling laugh, the figure vanished into the night, leaving me alone in the fog. The following days were a blur of riches. I woke to find my modest home transformed into a mansion of opulence, filled with treasures that seemed to appear from nowhere. Gold coins spilled from my pockets, jewels glittered on every surface, and my business flourished beyond measure. I had become a man of influence, courted by the wealthy and powerful, admired by all who crossed my path. But with each day that passed, the hunger grew. At first it was subtle, a gnawing sensation in the pit of my stomach, a strange emptiness that could not be filled by food or drink. Then, the hunger began to take form, a presence that lurked in the corners of my mind, whispering to me in the dark hours of the night. The beast, this thing I had bound myself to, demanded more. It was no longer content with the offerings I had given it. It needed more than mere animals, more than the blood of those I had sacrificed in my desperation. The hunger was a living thing, a ravenous force that clawed at the edges of my sanity. I had begun to feed it as the figure had instructed, offering it the flesh of those who crossed my path. Beggars, thieves, the desperate souls who wandered the streets at night. But as I fed it, the hunger grew, and the price became more terrifying. The beast's demands became more grotesque, more depraved. It wanted more than blood. It wanted pain, suffering, the very essence of life itself. It wanted flesh. And I, bound by the curse of my own greed, was compelled to obey. The creature's presence grew stronger with each passing day, its whispers louder, its hunger more insistent. I could feel it watching me, its eyes like burning coals, its breath hot and fetid against my skin. It was always there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to feed it. But as the hunger consumed me, so too did my soul. I began to wither, my body growing pale and gaunt, my eyes sunken and hollow. The wealth I had once craved now felt like a curse, a weight that threatened to crush me. I had become a prisoner to the very thing I had sought to control. One night, as I knelt before the beast, offering it yet another sacrifice, I realized the truth. The hunger would never be sated. The more I gave, the more it demanded. And one day, it would come for me, as it had promised. I would be consumed, body and soul, until nothing remained but the empty shell of a man who had once dreamed of wealth. I had made a bargain with the devil, and now I would pay the price. Whispers in the dark. It was on a night thick with fog and shadows that Eleanor Montgomery first heard the whispers. At first they were faint, like the rustling of dry leaves, barely audible over the creaking of the old house. But as the hours wore on, the voices grew louder, their words piercing the stillness of the night. They were not the voices of the living, but something darker, something ancient, twisted by time and malice. Eleanor, a woman of sound mind and steady nerves, dismissed the voices as the figments of a weary mind. She had recently moved into the sprawling manor, inherited from a distant relative whose name was now little more than a forgotten whisper in the annals of her family's history. The house, though grand in its decaying beauty, had always been a place of unease. The air within its walls seemed thick, as if the house itself breathed with a heavy, unseen presence. But Eleanor, ever practical, attributed the disquiet to the unfamiliarity of her new surroundings. The first night the whispers came, they spoke only of her childhood fears, forgotten memories of things that lurked in dark corners and monsters that had haunted her dreams. The voice was soft, almost tender, like the murmur of a long-lost friend. But with each passing night, the whispers grew more insistent, more invasive. They spoke of things no one could have known, secrets buried deep within her heart, fears she had never uttered aloud. They spoke of her most intimate thoughts, the hidden corners of her soul, and with each whisper, a sense of dread began to seep into her very bones. By the third week, Eleanor could no longer sleep. The whispers came at all hours, taunting her, mocking her, filling her mind with a constant nagging terror. It was as though the very walls of the manor had become a mouth, speaking her darkest truths and desires. The words grew sharper, more venomous, as if the house itself had become aware of her every weakness, every fear. Desperate to silence the voices, Eleanor began to search for their source. She scoured the house from attic to cellar but found nothing. The walls were solid, the windows sealed tight. There were no hidden passages, no secret rooms. Yet each night the whispers continued, growing louder, until they seemed to echo within her very mind. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows stretched long and ominous, Eleanor stumbled upon a dusty old book in the manor's library. It was bound in dark leather, its pages yellowed with age, and its cover adorned with strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the dim light. Her hands trembled as she opened the book, the whispers in her mind growing louder with each page she turned. What she discovered was a history darker than any she could have imagined. The book spoke of an ancient curse, one that had been passed down through generations of her family. A curse that bound the Montgomery bloodline to the very house she now inhabited. The whispers, it seemed, were not merely the product of her imagination, but the voices of the spirits who had been trapped within the manor for centuries. They were the souls of those who had come before her, their lives consumed by the curse that had bound them to the house. The more she read, the more the whispers seemed to grow in intensity, until they became a deafening roar in her ears. They spoke of death, of betrayal, of bloodshed, of a pact made long ago, a pact that had doomed her family to an eternity of suffering. And now, it seemed, the curse had come for her. As the night deepened, Eleanor felt the cold grip of terror tighten around her heart. The whispers no longer spoke of her secrets. They spoke of the curse itself, of the ancient forces that had woven her fate into their dark tapestry. They promised her that she would join the others, that she would become a part of the house, her soul forever bound to its walls. With a final, desperate cry, Eleanor tried to flee, but it was too late. The whispers were no longer just voices. They were shadows, twisting and crawling from the corners of the room, reaching for her with cold, skeletal hands. She could feel their icy touch on her skin, could hear their breath on her neck. The house had claimed her, as it had claimed so many before her, and as the last of her strength faded, the whispers ceased. The house fell silent, its hunger sated, for now. But Eleanor Montgomery's fate was sealed. The whispers would continue, waiting for the next soul to come, to hear their voices, to unravel the dark truth that had bound them all to the house. For the curse was eternal, and the whispers would never stop. The last midnight train. The station was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that made the hum of fluorescent lights feel deafening. David checked his watch again. Midnight. He glanced around, his breath visible in the frigid air. The platform was deserted, save for a flickering sign that read, "Next train, 12:01 a.m." He wasn't sure why he'd taken this late train. His day had been long, and exhaustion weighed heavy on him. But something about the idea of a midnight journey felt necessary. He brushed off the unease creeping up his spine and stepped closer to the edge of the platform as the train pulled in. The train was old, its metallic surface dulled with age and grime. The doors opened with a hiss, and David hesitated. The interior was dimly lit, the seats worn and frayed. Still, he stepped inside. The doors shut behind him with a metallic groan, and the train jolted forward. He looked around. The carriage was empty, except for a figure seated at the far end. The man wore a conductor's uniform, his cap tilted low over his face. David moved to sit, but before he could settle, the conductor's voice rang out, low and gravelly. "Ticket." David blinked. "I didn't." The conductor raised a hand, silencing him. In his other hand was a ticket black as ink, with David's name scrawled across it in silver letters. He handed it over without a word. "What is this?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The conductor didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the window. "Look." David turned to see the world outside the train had changed. The city lights were gone, replaced by an endless expanse of barren land. The ground was cracked and dry, stretching to a horizon shrouded in swirling mist. "What is this place?" "The place between," the conductor replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "You've boarded the last midnight train. There's only one way back." David's heart pounded. "What do you mean? Back to where?" "To your life," the conductor said, leaning closer. His eyes, now visible beneath the brim of his cap, gleamed unnaturally. "But first, you must face what brought you here." The train screeched to a halt, the sound grating against David's ears. The doors slid open, revealing the desolate wasteland beyond. The conductor gestured for him to step out. David hesitated. "What happens if I don't?" The conductor's expression didn't change. "Then you stay here. Forever." With no other choice, David stepped off the train. The ground was cold beneath his feet, the air heavy and oppressive. The train vanished behind him, leaving only silence. As he walked, the mist thickened, and shadows began to form within it. Whispers surrounded him, faint and unintelligible at first, but growing louder with each step. "David!" He froze. The voice was familiar. Turning, he saw a figure emerge from the mist. A woman, her face pale and eyes hollow. "Emily," he whispered, his throat tight. It was his wife, or rather a twisted version of her. She stared at him with a mixture of sorrow and anger. "Why didn't you save me?" David stumbled back, memories flooding his mind. Emily had died in a car accident 2 years ago. He had been driving. "I tried," he choked out. You didn't try hard enough," she interrupted, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You let me die." The ground beneath him cracked, and he fell to his knees. "I didn't mean to." The mist swirled, and more figures appeared. His father, his childhood friend, a co-worker, faces from his past, each accusing him of failures and betrayals. "You were never there for me. You lied to me. You ruined everything." The voices grew louder, merging into a deafening cacophony. David clutched his head, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. "Enough!" he screamed. The mist stilled, and the figures froze. The silence was heavy, pressing down on him. "You're right," he said, his voice trembling but resolute. "I made mistakes. I've hurt people. but I can't change the past. All I can do is try to be better. The figures began to dissolve, their expressions softening. The mist lifted, revealing the train waiting ahead. The conductor stood by the open door, his face unreadable. David approached cautiously. "Did I pass?" The conductor stepped aside, allowing him to board. "You face the truth. That's all that matters." As the train began to move, the barren landscape outside gave way to the familiar city skyline. David sank into his seat, the weight on his chest finally lifting. When the train pulled into his station, he stepped off and turned to thank the conductor. But the train was gone, leaving only the faint echo of its whistle in the night. David walked home, the memories of the journey etched into his mind. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain.